Good morning, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Another episode of The Breakup, a show where we take a psychological look at the relationship we have with the US dollar, with the US financial system, and contrast it with Bitcoin and discuss why it's not about trading dollars for Bitcoin, it's a psychological shift. And really, the right way to approach it is to break up, right? It's a mournful experience, it's difficult, but we're going to give you the reasons and support for which you the reasons and support that you could use to go through this breakup, because the breakup will choose you. Sometimes you get dumped, and we got a system that you can dump it first, but it's going to dump you eventually. And today, given that it's the day after Thanksgiving, slow news day, so we're going to take a bit of a bigger picture. We're not going to just use Bitcoin and dollars as a lens to look at current news today, which is normally what we do here, right? We look at reasons in the news that will help convince you, I suppose, or help give you the frame or the mindset to understand why it's a breakup situation and not just an investment, or not just choosing Bitcoin over dollars. None of that's quite enough. That whole old mindset is where you end up getting this world. When are you going to sell your Bitcoin? You know what I mean? And then people don't understand, like, when are you going to cash out, right? And then Bitcoiners will say, well, I don't think you really get it, right? So there's no cashing out for Bitcoiners. And this show kind of gets to the reasons why, right? Most Bitcoiners have already broken up with the fiat system. So this show is not really intended for people who get Bitcoin. I think they can get a lot of utility out of it, because I'll sort of underline why certain things in the world we all know today are full of entropy. So and maybe not so useful anymore, right? And so we're trying to give you those reasons why you'd want to break up, and why it's probably best to break up, right? So today, as I said, a bit of a slower news day. So we're going to be comparing, just because it is in the news today, the ESG stuff, right? Environmental and social governance. You hear that a lot, right? Environmental and social governance. BlackRock, one of the biggest, investment firms in the world, has taken this sort of matrix of ESG, environmental and social governance investing, right? So we're not actually here to talk about whether ESG should be used or not. That's not what we're covering today. What we're covering is these two contracts, right? Royalty contracts. And there are two royalty contracts that are really popular today, and that you can see throughout our world as important commercial relationships. The first is in publishing, right? And oil and gas is the other. Those are the two major royalty contracts which are at scale globally. Everyone recognizes a royalty contract, and are at the heart of millions of commercial relationships around the world. Kind of a bedrock of the commercial relationships that help perpetuate the world. So what we are saying when we say break up with the US dollar, it's about realigning commercial relationships, really, in the end, right? It's about which commercial relationships are appropriate and which aren't. The whole idea of Bitcoin being a P2P network versus another digital banking network, which required three parties, always three parties, right? In the way the entire internet has been built until now. Someone to facilitate the change, an intermediary, right? A trusted third-party intermediary. Bitcoin, of course, says we don't need that commercial relationship. We can do it bilaterally between two people. So that's already a beginning of where these commercial relationships are different in Bitcoin versus the fiat world, or the post World War II world order that we all recognize. So we've got these two types of royalty contracts, right? Really important. Now, I've sort of highlighted here this piece in the middle. This is really important to contrast why these are different, right? So what I'm going to try and underline here is why oil and gas royalty contracts offer a window for Bitcoin to take over as the global reserve currency, but also to show where the commercial relationships that came from fiat-designed royalty contracts, particularly in publishing, mark the end of them as utility, right? Now, I'm not saying there's not going to be any publishing contracts anymore. I'm saying that the structure is going to change, and it will mimic more of this one. So I'm going to contrast them, and then you'll see why the oil and gas one is important for Bitcoin, and why publishing will likely move over to that. You're already hearing it with this Web3 stuff all the time, right? So we're going to get to that. So first up, let's look at the royalty contract for publishing, right? So the publisher is in the middle here, right? We got a publisher, right? So that's not the actual creator of the intellectual property, right? That's important. That's an important distinction. The creator of the intellectual property is outside of this relationship. And this is how it works. The publisher actually buys, in the case of a book, in the case of music, in the case of many things, intellectual property, or even in some cases, some art, whatever is being created in general. There's some journalism, I suppose. You can also look at it this way, except you'd have to change this commercial relationship. But the writer is on the outside, right? The publisher is in the middle of royalty contracts. And this is what happens. The publisher actually buys the IP, depending on the market, from the creator, right? So let's say this is, I don't know, Simon and Schuster, and that's J.K. Rowling, right? They buy the copyright from her, right? And then they pay her a royalty, right? Now, J.K. Rowling's a separate case because she's so famous. Let's just take, a B kind of list writer. What they're going to get in the end from the publisher, right, is 5 to 10% of the royalties will go to, this is the other way around. So 5 to 10% will go to the creator, right, of the sales eventually. They'll get an advance, anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000. They get this advance, right? And then going forward, they'll get 5 or 10% of royalties, right? So, but the publisher handles the marketing, they put it on the bookshelves, they do all those other things, right? And then they go to sales, right? So the money comes back to the publisher, and then they're only giving 5 or 10% to the actual creator, right? Now, analogous to that contract is the oil and gas royalty contract, right? But it works differently. The oil and gas property owner is in the middle of the commercial relationship. It's not the same as the publisher, right? The landowner here, the landowner, not the oil and not the driller, not the person doing the work, right? The person who owns the land, right? So in this case, the landowner is in the middle of the commercial relationship, right? Much like the writer is on the outside here, right? They're not in the middle. Here, the oil and gas landowner is in the middle. And what happens is investors come in and purchase the right to drill and all these things, right, from the landowner. And they go out and do it, right? So when the money comes back, right, it goes first into the landowner, right? And then the royalties are divvied out to the investors, right? Now, what this ends up doing is, because the landowner is in the middle, they may have an awful lot of choice they can make as to who they deal with, what kind of contracts they offer, what kind of energy they're even dealing with, right? It's the land. So there's a lot of discretion in that middle ground for the landowner. And they're the centerpiece of the royalty contract, right? Unlike in publishing, where the publisher is the centerpiece, buying the intellectual property, selling it, and then distributing the royalties back to the creator, like they're just some investor in the case of the royalty contracts. In the end, it's a question of power, I suppose, right? Because the oil and gas landowner has the same power the publisher has, not the creator, the same power the publisher has. They can decide what they want to do. They can decide who they're going to enter into commercial relationships with, right? So in this case, investors can talk about ESG, environmental, social governance, all they want on the outside, right? If they can't form a commercial relationship with the landowner, it doesn't really matter, right? They can't influence too much about what the landowner does, right? Now, if a wall of money appears on that side, it certainly will affect what the folks here are doing, right? Certainly. So if wind all of a sudden is more beneficial for that land, for oil and gas folks, they will, right? And policy can help drive what investors do, certainly, right? No one's denying that. But the difference is with Bitcoin, we have a whole new class of investor, right? So even if BlackRock and the ESG folks beat it, there's a whole new crowd that's there to take their place. Regulation willing, right? Unless they're totally blocked out, right? Which is a problem. But But nevertheless, the oil and gas folks still have a tremendous sovereignty in who they deal with. They don't have to deal with BlackRock. They don't have to deal with any of these folks, right? Now, if we look at how this works in news media or other industries, right? Of course, the publisher becomes a type of choke point, right? So because it's a choke point, they can decide who to publish. You know, Stephen King for many years predicted that in that old era of publishing, that the people deciding who to sign as a writer, you know, who to make famous, basically, whose book to put on the shelves, you know, Stephen King always said the publishers had it wrong, and they weren't really accurately judging the market. That's why, you know, in his mind, his sort of fast food books, lowbrow books, were not so favored because they had an idea of the ideal reader which was inaccurate, that they wanted a lot of, you know, intellectual copy and stories and da, 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 da. So he predicted this for a long time. He said they were off, right? They were off. Ebook sales and the rise of self-publishing has helped prove Stephen King right, because the markets for the ebooks are heavily into the romance ones with the I love you and the handsome guy and this and that, and then the sci-fi stuff, right? Really big. But because these guys don't have the same kind of publishing, they were able to go creator sales and market and get that feedback loop and find out if there was a market, if there was a fit, and etc. A lot of what we talk about when we hear about Web3 and NFTs and the creator economy and all that stuff, what it's really saying is that the publishers are going to be out, and it'll mimic self-publishing with advanced tools and the ability to create more efficient markets, more touch points between creator and market, and then we'll alter the royalty contract by taking the publisher basically out of the middle. That's sort of the promise of the internet from the very beginning, right? Why that contrast and why this is so big for Bitcoin, right, is that the oil and gas contract, the landowners, the people there are less influenced in the same way that publishers were, because they're not actually creating the work. They're deciding what to show, right? In the case of the oil and gas, they just want to make money, right? It's not about some grand narrative fulfilling, you know, certain objectives that a publisher who's not really in touch with creators, and in some cases sales as well, right? So in this case, the feedback loop can directly happen. The feedback loop can directly happen between the landowners and the investors coming from Bitcoin. The investors coming from Bitcoin, the Bitcoin world, that world that wants to back money by energy, do not need to compete with the ESG folks, right? If the ESG folks leave the room and the Bitcoiners come in, they can keep this market going, right? And if the Bitcoiners are the first into the oil and gas, the way I'm predicting they will be, what you're going to get is a tremendous effect where no one understands the value because they're so blinded by ESG, social governance, etc., investment choices, that Bitcoiners can actually get great deals, right, on oil and gas royalties, right? So that's the argument, that the great deals available for oil and gas royalties will actually crown Bitcoin. That folks who go after the ESG models are going to miss out on this opportunity, and in the end, will actually do more to promote Bitcoin, which is great, right? Which is what we want. But in the end, this contract here, the sanctity of this contract, right, is what needs to be guarded and what's important, right? Landowners deciding who to get into commercial relationships with that are bilateral is the most important thing, right? If policy starts dictating who they can deal with, we're in big, big trouble. Then it looks more like the publishing industry, right? But if Bitcoiners are there to fulfill the market and to take up the slack and burden when all of these folks like BlackRock want to kill an industry and start investing in other stuff, then it's super important for Bitcoiners to pile into this, get the good deals, and sustain this oil and gas royalty contract, because it's this royalty contract that can crown Bitcoin more than any other. And if this works the way it ought to, it should give us that parallelism, you know, that people will see royalty contracts work better in this streamlined bilateral nature, where the owner, in this case landowner, in this case IP owner, is at the heart of the commercial relationship and not on the outside as if they're just another ESG investor, right? That's the world we don't want. So the prediction is that a lot of these ESG policies that have already been made around the environment and around our energy matrix are going to come back and bite folks soon. And hopefully that, continues to pave the way for Bitcoin, because it looks like that a lot of the choices that were made in Europe around the energy matrix, around ESG investments, um, might lead them to a world where they have a cold winter and they don't have enough energy to get through. We'll see if that happens exactly. I'm predicting, depending on weather, it's weather related. But there is a greater than 50% chance that Europeans are faced with reality around the decisions they made with energy this year and got to pay the Russians probably to get what they need. We'll see if that happens. I don't mind buying oil off of them for now. I mean, they would have to. But if that doesn't help perpetuate the idea and give folks another reason for which they would want to break up with the fiat system, I don't know what will, because energy, heat, and all that stuff should orange pill people real quick if the know-it-alls have screwed it up until now. All right, everyone, that's a short episode for today. Lots of things to do. Day after Thanksgiving. So trying to enjoy it with the family. We've got the Christmas tree to decorate and all that other stuff. Had a great time last night. Everyone was here and enjoying our holiday, and always a time of reflection for Bitcoiners. So it's another one of those measuring sticks about how many years you've been in the industry and the rest of it. All right, team. See you tomorrow.